This is part 2. They used my words against me. How the Nazis destroyed a civilization. The dark side of emotional intelligence. Well, here we have a file photo of the entrance to Auschwitz. You can see how cold and very difficult it was to live under these circumstances back during the time of the incarceration. Another file photo. There were more than 10 death camps throughout Poland and Germany and Russia, and most of them were in Poland. The war actually began in September of 1939. Full-scale war began with the invasion of Poland. Britain and France declared war on September 3rd of the same year. This was called the European Theater. All of the countries that were involved in Europe. There was also the Pacific Theater, which is a different story about the situation with Pearl Harbor and Japan. The U.S. declared war on December 7th, 1941, and that was Pearl Harbor. The Pacific Theater, and Japan, remember, was allied with Germany. The war didn't end till September 2nd of 1945. That was 6 long years. Hitler began imprisoning people well before the war actually began. He became chancellor in 1933. The war began in 1939. And there were many, many concentration camps where Hitler imprisoned people from those years between 1933 and 1939. Now, it's very interesting, but statistics show that 41% of Americans do not know anything about Auschwitz. Pictured here is the ruins of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. Auschwitz I, the Polish concentration camp, was relatively small. So just a few miles away, the German people built Auschwitz II. You can see that many of the foundations of the barracks are there, but the barracks are no longer there. When I took this picture in the summer of 2017, I noticed how few buildings were standing. And then there was a story of a young girl who was studying to be an architect. She went up to one of the captains of the Nazi Guard and reported that, I want to tell you a little bit about these buildings. The foundation isn't very good. They're not going to stand for a very long time. The guard listened to her, and as she walked away, he shot her in the back. So they were so cruel, the German people, the German Nazi people, during this concentration camp era. Holocaust Remembrance Day is actually in April of each year, and this was the world's greatest genocide. We'll mention it again, but over 1 million people were cremated in Auschwitz I. This is another file photo of the 728 Polish prisoners who were brought to Auschwitz, the first group back in June of 1940. And they were transported in cattle cars. There was fear and anxiety. And the emotional intelligence, social awareness, the prisoners would try to calm one another's fears. Social awareness. That's pretty much what kept them under check. Here is a picture of the actual cattle cars. The larger box cars behind them had 80 to a car, traveling days at a time, with no facilities at all and no stopping for facilities. So you can understand the terrible kind of conditions that were going on within these train cars. They thought that the train was going to an ammunition factory where they were going to make weapons. But then they saw the sign, Auschwitz. Very interesting. Some of the non-Jewish people at the time in the area would shout to the trains that they were going to a place that was very terrible, that they were going to their death, and nobody really understood. Here's one of those larger boxcars. Actually, in the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C., they have a cattle car that was used to transport prisoners. And the cattle car, you can actually go into that car in the museum in Washington. It was placed inside the building before the roof was put on. So as they were building the museum, the cattle car was lowered into the building and then the roof was put on. So if you ever have the opportunity to travel to Washington, D.C., to the Holocaust Museum, this is something that you can experience. This is an actual photo that I took back in 2017. It is a photo of the gas chamber in Auschwitz. In this gas chamber, 1.1 million people were gassed during the war. Now that's pretty interesting. In the 5 years, that's like half of the population of New York City was gassed in this gas chamber. You may wonder how so many people were killed and how the Nazi German soldiers were able to deal with all those people. Well, actually, this is another side, another dark side of emotional intelligence. It was actually some of the prisoners themselves, some of the Jewish prisoners who were called Kapo, K-A-P-O. They were put in charge of the people that went through the camp. And they actually did the work for the German soldiers. So it wasn't the soldiers who did the gassing. It wasn't the soldiers who moved the dead bodies. It wasn't the soldiers who cremated the dead bodies and removed their remains, but it was the actual prisoners. What kind of emotional intelligence went through their minds as they engaged in these activities? They did these things to stay alive, obviously. But we're told that many of these Kapo, actual prisoners who worked for the German Nazis, were sometimes more cruel than the soldiers themselves. Very interesting. And one would have to wonder, if you were put in that situation, what you would do. This is the actual crematorium in Auschwitz. It is a picture that I took. It is not a file photo. And there were so many people being killed that in 1943, as we mentioned, Auschwitz II was built. And that had 4 huge crematoriums and 8 gas chambers, 46 ovens. Terrible, terrible thing. In total, during the war, there were 11 million people that were killed, and 1.1 million of them were children. Here is the smokestack that's attached to those ovens in Auschwitz. People in the area could smell the cremations, and it was a very terrible smell, so they knew what was going on, yet they chose to stay away to protect themselves. Goal setting used for evil purposes. Remember, Hitler thought if he destroyed the Jewish population, he could create a superior race. Now, this is another photo that I took of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. It's a very famous photo. I had wanted to get a better picture, but this is all I could get as we were passing by. A terrible place, had many crematoriums, as I mentioned before. Now, if you have the opportunity, there's a movie that you should watch. It's called Schindler's List. And it's about a manufacturer in Poland who was actually working for the Nazi soldiers. When you watch the movie, please take a look and see when you find the picture of the train pulling up to the entrance to Auschwitz. This is a better photo. This is a file photo of the entrance. But very interesting is that Schindler was actually against the German Nazi forces, but talked to them and tried to save some of the Jewish people who were sent to the concentration camps. He actually made weapons for Germany, but what he did was he made the weapons out of alignment, so that many of the shells that were being produced for weapons were not of the right size, and they would jam in the guns. So he was trying to do this without letting on to the German Nazi bosses what was actually going on. And in the meantime, he was trying to save as many people that he could. Schindler is actually a company that is still in Poland. They make elevators. When I was in Poland, I actually went on an elevator, and there at the bottom of the elevator it says Schindler. And very interesting, if you go to the Freehold Mall and take one of the escalators, you'll see at the top of the escalators engraved in the metal is Schindler. And again, that's the same company. This is another photo that I took. And as the train would pull up to the entrance and the prisoners would get off the train, they would form a line. And the commandant would stand at the center of the line, and he would point to the right with his thumb or point to the left. The people who went to the right were the people who would stay imprisoned and would work in the factories. The people who were pointed to the left would go directly to the gas chambers. A very terrible kind of thing. And again, that movie Schindler's List, you'll be able to see some of the things that we're talking about. Once again, the barbed wire, electrified barbed wire. Many prisoners thought it would be better to die, so they tried to either climb or get through the barbed wire, the electrified barbed wire, and they would commit suicide in trying. But they felt that that was a better way to die than what was planned for them in the concentration camps. So what are we talking about in terms of the size of the camps? The Polish military base, Auschwitz, that was taken over, was actually 20 acres. And it's hard to understand the concept of how large acres are when they're put together. But Auschwitz II, Birkenau, which is not far away, was 472 acres. Now that's about the same size as Great Adventure in Jackson. All of the activities that go on in Great Adventure, from the animals over to the rides, that's about 472 acres, and that's the size of Auschwitz II, Birkenau. Again, there were very many concentration camps, but there were about 10 major death camps, or extermination camps that they were called. About 7 of them were in Poland. I'll mention some of the names so that you may have heard them when you're studying World War II, so you might recognize them. But the famous ones are Auschwitz, of course, Auschwitz II or Birkenau, Buchenwald, Treblinka. Okay, those are some of the famous ones. And then in Germany, there was Dachau. It was a very, very sad situation for many, many people. Here is a picture of the guard tower that stands outside Auschwitz II, Birkenau. So in addition to the barbed wired fences, there was a guard tower to make sure that nobody would try to escape, or nobody would escape if they tried. They might not live after that, but they would not escape. Which brings us to another story. And this is the end of part 2. In part 3, we'll discuss how maybe a good side of emotional intelligence was a little spark in all of the terrible things that were going on in Auschwitz.